How well do you know your neighbors? Think about it. The people living right next to you, separated by a wall, a fence, a few feet of space. You hear them sometimes. Footsteps, voices, music. But do you really know them? Do you know what happens when the doors close? What happens when nobody's watching? Most of us don't. Most of us don't want to. We keep to ourselves. Mind our own business. That's the polite thing to do, right? But sometimes, minding your own business means missing something important. Sometimes it means missing someone who desperately needs help. This is the story of Margaret Foster, 74 years old, retired teacher, and the woman who saved a life by simply paying attention. Margaret had lived in the same house in Islington for 42 years, a small terraced house on a quiet street. She'd raised 2 children there, buried her husband there, watched the neighborhood change around her, new families moving in, young couples, students, the area getting more expensive every year. Margaret's children wanted her to move, somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. But Margaret loved her house, loved her street, loved knowing her neighbors. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed things, who said good morning, who remembered birthdays, who watered your plants when you were on holiday, the kind of neighbor most people appreciated but took for granted. Just Margaret, always there, always watching, always caring, but never interfering, never nosy, just observant. The new neighbors moved in next door in March, a young couple, early 30s. The woman was called Sarah, blonde hair, thin, quiet smile. She worked from home, Margaret learned, something with computers. The man was Tom, tall, confident, worked in finance in the city. Nice suit every morning. Margaret introduced herself the day they moved in, brought over tea and biscuits. Welcome to the street. If you need anything, I'm just next door. Sarah had smiled, thanked her, but there was something in her eyes, something Margaret couldn't quite name. A hesitation, a wariness. Tom had been friendly enough. Shook Margaret's hand, made jokes about the moving boxes. But he stood close to Sarah, very close, hand on her back, guiding her, controlling her. Margaret noticed, but she didn't say anything. What could she say? They seemed like a nice couple. The first few weeks were quiet. Margaret would see Sarah occasionally, in the garden, at the front door, always polite, always smiling, but never relaxed, never comfortable. And Tom, he was different. Louder, more present. His voice carried through the walls. Margaret could hear him sometimes, talking on the phone, laughing. But when Sarah spoke, Margaret could barely hear her, a whisper, a murmur, like she was trying not to take up space. Margaret told herself she was reading too much into it. She was old. Lonely maybe. Seeing problems where there weren't any. Young couples argue. That's normal. It's not her business. But then Margaret started noticing other things, small things. The way Sarah never left the house without Tom, the way she dressed, long sleeves, even in warm weather, scarves, high collars. The way she flinched when Tom raised his voice, the way she apologized constantly. Sorry, I'm sorry, for everything, for nothing. One evening in May, Margaret was in her kitchen making tea, the window was open, the walls between the houses were thin, and she heard it. Tom's voice, loud, angry. You're useless, you know that? Absolutely useless. I work all day and you can't even get dinner ready on time. What do you even do all day? Then Sarah's voice, quiet, shaking. I'm sorry, I lost track of time. I was working and I just lost track. More shouting. Excuses. Always excuses. You're pathetic. The sound of something hitting the wall. A crash. Then silence. Margaret stood frozen, her hand shaking. Should she call someone? The police? But what would she say? She heard an argument. Couples argue. Maybe she misheard. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounded, but deep down, Margaret knew. She knew because she'd been a teacher for 35 years. She'd seen it before. Children with bruises, children who flinched, children who apologized for existing, and she'd seen the parents, the ones who smiled in public, who were charming and polite, who seemed perfect, until you looked closer, until you noticed. Margaret had always noticed. It was her gift and her curse. The next morning, Margaret saw Sarah in the garden, hanging laundry. Margaret walked to the fence. Good morning, dear. How are you? Sarah turned, smiled, that same tight smile. I'm fine, thank you. How are you? Margaret looked at her carefully. Sarah was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. In May. And there, just visible at her wrist, a bruise. Purple, finger-shaped. Margaret felt her heart sink. Are you sure you're all right? Sarah's smile faltered. Just for a second. Yes, I'm fine, just clumsy. Knocked my arm on the door. Margaret wanted to say something, wanted to ask, but Sarah's eyes were pleading. Don't ask, don't make me say it, don't make this real. So Margaret nodded. Well, if you ever need anything, tea, a chat, anything at all, I'm right here. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, just for a moment, then she blinked them away. Thank you, Margaret, that's very kind. And she went back inside, quickly, like she'd said too much already. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop worrying. She started paying closer attention, listening, watching, not to be nosy, but because she was scared, scared that something terrible was happening next door, and nobody else was noticing. Nobody else was paying attention. She heard arguments most nights now. Tom's voice, always angry, always blaming. Sarah's voice, always apologizing, always small. She saw Sarah less and less. When she did see her, there were more bruises, more excuses. Walked into a cupboard, tripped on the stairs, fell in the shower. And Sarah stopped making eye contact, stopped smiling, started looking hollow, empty, like she was disappearing. Margaret tried talking to her daughter about it, mentioned her concerns. Her daughter said what everyone says. Mum, it's not your business. You don't know what goes on behind closed doors. Maybe they're just having problems. Maybe you're imagining things. Don't get involved. It could be dangerous. And Margaret understood. She did. Getting involved was risky. What if she was wrong? What if she made things worse? What if Tom found out she'd interfered? But then Margaret remembered something. She remembered a girl in her class. Years ago. A sweet girl, 10 years old, always tired, always wearing long sleeves. Margaret had suspected something, had noticed. But she hadn't been sure, hadn't wanted to interfere, hadn't wanted to accuse without proof. So she'd done nothing. And 3 months later, that girl ended up in hospital. Broken arm, cracked ribs. Her father had been arrested. And Margaret had carried that guilt for decades, because she'd noticed, she'd known something was wrong. But she hadn't acted. She'd minded her own business, and that girl had paid the price. Margaret wasn't going to make that mistake again. She couldn't, even if she was wrong, even if people thought she was interfering, even if it was dangerous. She had to do something. Because noticing isn't enough. Noticing without acting is just witnessing. And Margaret refused to be just a witness. One night in June, Margaret heard it again. Shouting. Louder than before, Sarah's voice, crying, please, please stop. Tom's voice, vicious, this is your fault, all of it, you make me do this. Then a scream, cut short, and then silence, the kind of silence that's worse than noise. Margaret didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone, dialed 999. Police, please. I need to report a domestic disturbance. My neighbor next door. I think someone's being hurt. The operator was calm, professional. What's the address? What have you heard? Margaret told her everything. The arguments, the bruises, the scream. The operator said police were on their way. Stay inside, don't intervene. Margaret agreed, but she couldn't just wait. She went to her window, watched. 5 minutes later, a police car pulled up. Quiet. No sirens. 2 officers got out, knocked on the door. Margaret watched Tom answer, all smiles, confused, polite. No, officer, everything's fine, just a disagreement. You know how it is. The officers asked to come in, asked to speak to Sarah. Tom hesitated, then agreed. Still smiling, still charming. Margaret couldn't see what happened inside, could only wait. 10 minutes felt like hours. Then the officers came out, and with them Sarah. She was holding a small bag. Her face was red, swollen, one eye nearly closed. The officers were gentle with her, guiding her to the car. Tom was still in the doorway, no longer smiling, staring at Margaret's house. He knew someone had called. Margaret stepped back from the window, heart pounding. The police car drove away with Sarah. Another car arrived. More officers. They went inside with Tom. Margaret learned later that they'd arrested him. Found evidence. Photos on Sarah's phone she'd been too scared to share. Messages, medical records. Sarah had been documenting everything, just in case. Just hoping that someday she'd be brave enough to leave. But she hadn't been able to, not alone. She'd needed someone to notice, someone to care enough to act. 2 days later, there was a knock on Margaret's door. It was Sarah, looking different. Still bruised, still thin, but standing straighter, eyes clearer. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you. You called the police, didn't you?" Margaret nodded. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I was worried." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life. Do you understand that? You saved my life. I couldn't leave. I tried. So many times. But he always convinced me to stay, said nobody would believe me, said I had nowhere to go, said it was my fault. And I started to believe him, started to think maybe I deserved it. Maybe I was the problem. But you noticed, you saw what was happening, and you cared enough to do something." Margaret reached out, took Sarah's hand. "I'm just glad you're safe now. Are you?" "Safe?" Sarah nodded. "I'm staying with my sister. For now. The police, they've been amazing. There's evidence, witnesses. He won't be able to hurt me anymore. I'm pressing charges. I'm getting a restraining order. I'm getting my life back. And it's because of you." Margaret shook her head. "It's because of you. You documented everything. You were brave. I just made a phone call." Sarah squeezed her hand. That phone call changed everything. Most people wouldn't have made it. Most people would have looked away, minded their own business, convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. But you didn't. You noticed. And you acted. And I'm alive because of it. The two women sat together for hours that afternoon, drinking tea, talking. Sarah told her story, the slow escalation, the isolation, the fear, the hope that it would get better, the realization that it wouldn't. Margaret listened, really listened, the way she'd always done with her students, with care, without judgment, just presence, just attention. Sarah told her later that conversation was the first time in 2 years she'd felt heard, really heard, not dismissed, not doubted, just believed. That was 6 months ago. Sarah lives in her own flat now. Small place in Camden. She's in therapy, rebuilding her life, rebuilding herself. Tom is awaiting trial, restraining order in place, and Sarah visits Margaret every week. They have tea, they talk. They've become friends, real friends. Sarah calls Margaret her guardian angel. Margaret just calls herself a neighbor who paid attention, who cared, who acted. Because that's what neighbors should do. Not mind their own business when someone needs help. Not look away when something's wrong. Not convince themselves it's not their problem. True neighbors notice. True neighbors care. True neighbors act. Here's what Margaret wants people to understand. Domestic abuse happens everywhere. Nice neighborhoods, expensive houses, behind closed doors that look perfect from the outside. The victims are your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends. And they need someone to notice, someone to care, someone brave enough to make that call, to speak up, to act, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's scary, even when people say it's not your business. Because it is your business. When someone is being hurt, it's everyone's business. Silence protects abusers. Noticing and acting saves lives. Margaret noticed, Margaret acted. And Sarah is alive today because of it. So let me ask you, do you know your neighbors? Really know them? And if you saw something, heard something, suspected something, would you act, or would you mind your own business? Think about that, because somewhere right now, someone is hoping that their neighbor is like Margaret Foster. Someone who notices, someone who cares, someone who acts. Be that neighbor, be that person, because you might be the only one who can help. You might be the only one paying attention. And that attention, that care, that one phone call could save a life. This is Valor Chronicles, where everyday courage changes everything. If Margaret's story moved you, hit subscribe. Share this with someone, and please leave a comment. Tell us if you've ever had to make a difficult choice to help someone, or if someone noticed when you needed help. Because these conversations matter, these stories matter, and the more we talk about this, the more we break the silence that protects abusers and traps victims. Be observant, be caring, be brave, be the neighbor who notices. Thanks for listening. See you in the next story.